September 1945. The war was over, but the air still trembled with the memory of fire. In a remote American POW camp on the edge of the Pacific, its wire fences humming in the heat, hundreds of Japanese prisoners stood in silence. Their uniforms were faded, their spirits even more so. For them, surrender was not just defeat. It was dishonor, carved into the soul. The guards moved quietly that morning, their boots crunching on gravel. Somewhere near the barracks, an American soldier lifted a battered trumpet. A few others stood beside him, sheet music trembling in their hands. The first notes that rose were strange, slow, and solemn. The melody foreign yet familiar to the men behind the fence. It was Kimigayo, the national anthem of Japan. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The prisoners froze. Some blinked in disbelief. Others lowered their heads, eyes wet with confusion. The sound carried through the camp, a hymn of loyalty, sorrow, and pride. And for the first time since their capture, the Japanese soldiers heard their homeland not as an enemy, but as a song. That morning would become one of the quietest acts of humanity in the Pacific War's aftermath. By the final months of 1945, the Pacific Ocean was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. From the jungles of Burma to the black sands of Iwo Jima, the Empire of Japan had fought with unyielding ferocity, guided by a code older than the war itself, Bushido, the way of the warrior. For them, to die in battle was honor. To be captured was shame. Yet, as mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Emperor Hirohito's trembling voice announced Japan's surrender on August 15th, millions of soldiers found themselves trapped in the unthinkable. Survival. More than 500,000 Japanese troops laid down their arms across the Pacific Islands, China, and Southeast Asia. Around 132,000 of them fell into American hands. The U.S. military suddenly faced a moral test of its own. The victors now had to decide, what does one do with a defeated enemy who once refused mercy? American policy toward POWs was shaped by the Geneva Convention of 1929, though Japan had not ratified it. The United States, however, was determined to uphold it, at least on paper. Camps were established in Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, and even on U.S. soil. Places like Camp McCoy in Wisconsin and Camp Honouliuli in Oahu. Each camp was a world unto itself. Rows of tents or wooden barracks stretched under the open sky. Barbed wire divided captors and captives, but it also enclosed shared routines, roll calls at dawn, rice rations, medical checks, and endless labor duties. To American guards, it was order. To the Japanese, it was purgatory. Most prisoners arrived gaunt, exhausted, and silent. Many were officers once sworn to die for the emperor. Their eyes avoided contact. They bowed when addressed, not out of submission, but because they no longer knew who they were without the uniform of the imperial army. The shame of captivity ran deep. In Japanese tradition, capture erased a soldier's name from the honor rolls. Families back home often received notice that their son had died in battle, even when he was alive in an Allied camp. Letters were rare, censored, and emotionally distant. For many, the war had stripped not just their homeland, it had stripped their identity. American guards noticed the strange discipline of these prisoners. They cleaned their quarters meticulously, held morning formations without orders, and saluted their captors as if they were still on parade. Some even practiced silent drills at dusk, wooden sticks replacing rifles. It was their way of surviving defeat, by pretending honor still existed in ritual. But beneath that calm, emotions churned. Many guards sensed the quiet despair that haunted the camp. Suicide attempts were not uncommon. In some barracks, men refused food, whispering old poems about cherry blossoms and sacrifice. Others gazed for hours at the Pacific horizon, as though searching for the islands they would never see again. Amid this tension, American authorities began to realize something. The war might be over militarily, but psychologically, it was not. These men were still fighting, not against the United States, but against themselves. That realization led to a shift in approach. The U.S. Army introduced what it called reorientation programs. Instead of breaking their prisoners, they would try to rebuild them, to teach democracy, personal freedom, and the idea that surrender did not have to mean humiliation. Classrooms were set up inside the camps. Chalkboards appeared beside barbed wire fences. Leaflets explained the new constitution being drafted in Tokyo. Some prisoners scoffed, others listened quietly. For the first time, they were being told that loyalty to an emperor could coexist with self-worth. Still, progress was fragile. Resentment ran deep on both sides. American guards remembered Pearl Harbor, Bataan, and Guadalcanal, places where mercy had rarely been returned. Trust came slowly, if at all. And yet, in one camp, a quiet, isolated one in the Pacific, something began to change. It wasn't policy. It wasn't punishment. It was a gesture, a small, almost invisible moment of respect that would leave a permanent mark on everyone who witnessed it. It began, as history often does, not with grand speeches or orders, but with music. The camp was small, tucked between low hills and a line of palms that swayed against the Pacific wind. Officially, it was designated as a temporary holding site, a place where Japanese prisoners waited for repatriation. But months after the surrender, few ships had come. The men inside the wire had begun to feel forgotten by the world. For American guards, life was routine. Wake at dawn, conduct roll call, distribute meals, watch the prisoners work in the fields or repair fences. The rhythm was dull, mechanical, yet beneath it was something quietly human. The war had ended, but they were still surrounded by reminders of it. The scars were visible on both sides. Some guards were veterans of the island campaigns, men who had seen friends die in Okinawa, Saipan, or Leyte Gulf. Their hatred had once been instinctive, but captivity had changed their perspective. Watching the defeated soldiers bow, repair trucks, and whisper prayers before eating, many began to see not enemies, but men, disciplined, broken, and strangely dignified. The camp commandant, an officer in his early 40s named Captain William Roberts, understood this change better than most. He had lost his brother at Pearl Harbor and had every reason to despise the enemy. Yet as months passed, his bitterness softened. "They've lost everything," he once remarked in a camp report. "To treat them without respect would be to lose ourselves." Under his leadership, the camp became something unusual, a place where order met empathy. Roberts encouraged his men to follow the Geneva rules strictly, even when it seemed unnecessary. Prisoners were allowed to write letters, attend classes, and maintain their cultural rituals, within reason. One day, a young Japanese interpreter, a former university student from Tokyo, approached the camp chapel. He asked permission to hold a short memorial for the war dead. Roberts hesitated but agreed under supervision. The ceremony was simple. A few bowed heads, a murmured prayer, and a brief song in low voices. But to the Japanese prisoners, it meant everything. That small act of permission opened a fragile bridge. Over the following weeks, American soldiers began to notice the prisoners humming familiar tunes in the evening, soft, almost hidden. Among them was Kimigayo, the anthem of an empire that no longer existed. The melody, slow and solemn, spoke of loyalty to a land they could no longer serve. Some guards listened quietly, others turned away. But Roberts watched with quiet reflection. He saw not defiance, but longing, a desperate need to remember who they were before defeat. It was around this time that an idea took root among a few American soldiers who had once played in regimental bands. They had instruments, a trumpet, a clarinet, a drum salvaged from a supply depot. In their off hours, they practiced American marches, hymns, and, sometimes, foreign songs they had heard on the radio. When word reached Roberts that they wanted to learn Kimigayo and perform it for the prisoners, his first reaction was disbelief. "You want to play their anthem?" he asked. "For the men who tried to kill us?" The sergeant leading the group simply nodded. "Sir, the war's over. Maybe it's time someone showed them what that means." After a long pause, Roberts agreed. There were no orders from Washington, no cameras, no headlines, just a quiet decision made on a humid afternoon. For the next few days, the sound of rehearsals drifted across the camp, uncertain, clumsy at first, then clearer with each note. The prisoners didn't know what was happening, but curiosity spread quickly. When the day came, they were told to assemble near the parade ground. No one knew why. As they lined up in neat, disciplined rows, the sun burned through the morning haze. The guards stood opposite, instruments ready. A hush settled over the camp, a silence so deep it seemed to press against the earth itself. Then, slowly, the first note rose, the anthem of Japan, played by the very men who had once fought to destroy it. And in that moment, war truly ended, not in treaties or tribunals, but in the trembling air between enemies who had finally remembered their shared humanity. When historians study the Pacific War, they often speak of grand strategies and decisive victories. But what happened that morning in the camp could not be measured in maps or medals. It was an emotional event, a convergence of pride, grief, and dignity. To understand its weight, one must see it from the eyes of both sides, the human, cultural, and moral dimensions that shaped it. The human angle for the Japanese prisoners, survival had been harder than death. Every sunrise behind the wire was a reminder that they had failed, not just as soldiers, but as sons of Japan. They carried the burden of a nation's shame, while their homeland lay in ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just stories to them. They were symbols of how the divine empire had fallen. When the Americans began to play Kimigayo, many of these men did not know how to react. Some froze in disbelief, others trembled. The anthem had been banned in many Allied-controlled areas, considered a relic of militarism. Yet here it was, played not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. The melody was slow and sorrowful, its lyrics centuries old. It spoke of eternal rain and unbroken loyalty, of stones that become moss-covered with time, symbols of endurance. As the familiar notes filled the air, some prisoners began to weep silently. Not for victory, not for pride, but for the simple realization that someone still saw them as human. For months, they had been ghosts in uniforms, bodies without a homeland. But in that instant, something stirred. The music did not erase their defeat, but it gave them back their identity. The cultural angle. To understand what Kimigayo meant, one must understand Japan itself. It was not just an anthem, it was a sacred pledge to the emperor, believed to be descended from the gods. To sing it was to affirm belonging to an eternal order, a bond deeper than nationhood. In wartime Japan, Kimigayo was performed before every school assembly, military parade, and public ceremony. It represented unity and divine purpose. To hear it again in captivity from the mouths of their former enemies was both disorienting and deeply symbolic. To many Japanese prisoners, this was not mockery. It was an act of grace. The Americans were not humiliating them. They were restoring a fragment of dignity that war had stolen. It challenged everything they had been taught about the enemy. That Americans were barbaric, dishonorable, and without respect for tradition. That single song, played by soldiers who once stormed beaches under fire, shattered those illusions. It forced the prisoners to confront a truth rarely seen in war. that humanity can survive even amid conquest. The American moral angle for the Americans, the gesture was equally profound. These were men who had seen the brutality of the Pacific firsthand, the fanatic charges, the refusal to surrender, the suicide attacks. Many of them had lost friends to an enemy who seemed to value death more than life. Yet, as the occupation began, U.S. military leaders emphasized a new principle. Victory was not complete without moral leadership. General Douglas MacArthur himself had spoken of rebuilding Japan with magnanimity rather than vengeance. Within the camp, this philosophy took quiet form. The decision to play Kimigayo was not about politics. It was about reclaiming humanity after years of hatred. By honoring the enemy's anthem, these soldiers were proving something to themselves. That compassion did not weaken victory, it purified it. For some, it was also an act of closure. They had fought, lost friends, and seen horrors beyond words. But now, as the trumpet carried the solemn melody, they could feel the war ending inside them too. One American guard later wrote in his diary, "They stood so still, it was like watching statues breathe. We played their song, and for once, no one felt superior. We were just men, and the sound was peace." It was a moment no side could have planned. One born from instinct, empathy, and exhaustion. The guards didn't know they were creating history. The prisoners didn't know they were witnessing forgiveness. But both understood, in their own ways, that this was something sacred. When the final note faded, no one spoke. The silence that followed was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of understanding. The war had ended, yes, but in that instant, something greater had begun. The slow rebuilding of respect between two peoples who had once sworn never to understand each other. And yet, this was only part of the story. There were deeper forces at work, psychological, leadership, and symbolic layers that would transform this moment from an act of kindness into a lesson in reconciliation that echoed far beyond the camp's fences. The first section explored the human, cultural and moral dimensions of the anthem moment. Yet to fully grasp its significance, we must consider the psychological, leadership, and symbolic perspectives, layers that reveal how a simple act of music could alter the relationship between captor and captive. The psychological angle war leaves wounds unseen. For Japanese prisoners, captivity carried a weight heavier than hunger or fatigue. Each day was a battle with internalized shame. In their culture, surrender was equated with failure, a stain on one's honor, often considered worse than death itself. Many men carried this burden silently, refusing to speak, eat, or even make eye contact. Hearing their anthem from the Americans triggered an unexpected cognitive dissonance. The melody, so tied to loyalty and national pride, should have been a weapon, a reminder of the enemy's dominance. Instead, it became a bridge. Psychologists today would recognize this as a moment of emotional reorientation. The prisoners were forced to reconcile their identity as defeated soldiers with the realization that the captors respected their dignity. Some men reportedly lowered their heads in silent weeping. Others stiffened, unsure whether the act was genuine or ironic. But as the music continued, defenses crumbled. For the first time since capture, they felt seen. Not as enemies, but as human beings. That psychological shift would influence interactions within the camp for months afterward, reducing tension and fostering small acts of cooperation that otherwise might have seemed impossible. The leadership angle. This moment did not occur spontaneously. It was the product of deliberate leadership. Captain William Roberts and his band of musicians recognized that the war had ended not just on battlefields, but inside the minds of the defeated. Roberts understood that demonstrating respect could have tactical and moral value. It would calm the prisoners, reduce incidents of resistance, and establish an environment conducive to orderly repatriation. The morning air was thick and humid, clinging to the skin of both guards and prisoners alike. The sun had not yet fully burned through the haze, and the Pacific breeze stirred the tops of palm trees that lined the perimeter of the camp. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers stood in formation, their eyes fixed on the distant horizon as if seeking answers there. The barbed wire fences that had defined their captivity suddenly felt heavier. Not just metal, but memory. Captain Roberts stood at the edge of the parade ground, his hands folded behind his back. A small group of American soldiers adjusted their instruments, a trumpet, a clarinet, and a battered drum. They had practiced for days, each note carefully studied, aware of the precariousness of the moment. In silence, the camp seemed to hold its breath. Then, a single trumpet note broke through the stillness. It was tentative at first, wavering like a candle flickering against the wind. The clarinet joined, soft and deliberate, and the drum provided a steady heartbeat beneath the melody. The tune was unmistakable, Kimigayo, slow, solemn, reverent. The prisoners froze. For many, the sound was impossible. An anthem of their homeland, performed not by fellow countrymen, but by the soldiers who had captured them. Some instinctively reached for their hats in salute. Others lowered their heads, unsure whether they should kneel or stand rigidly. A silence enveloped the camp that was almost sacred in its weight. Tears glistened in the eyes of some men. Their expressions shifted from disbelief to shock, then to an almost imperceptible relief. Here was a recognition they had not dared hope for, a validation of identity amid defeat. One former officer whispered under his breath, "They honor us." Another closed his eyes, allowing the melody to anchor memories of home, of cherry blossoms, and of duty fulfilled even in failure. The American soldiers played without a single falter. Each note carried more than music. It carried intention. They understood that this was not a performance. It was a bridge, fragile, tentative, but real. For them, it was an act of courage. To honor the enemy in this way required a steadiness beyond physical bravery. Moral bravery, the kind that only those who have witnessed war's cruelty can possess. Observers would later describe the scene as almost cinematic. A prisoner, stooped with fatigue, lifted his head slowly. The sun glinted off the sweat on his brow. Behind him, the rows of men were rigid, some trembling in ways that the guards could not fully see. The melody wove through the camp, brushing against the wire fences, whispering a language older than war. Respect. The significance extended beyond the moment itself. Within minutes, the mood shifted subtly. Where there had been tension, there was now quiet reflection. Prisoners began to stand straighter. Their eyes, though still wary, held a new glimmer, a cautious acknowledgement that defeat did not erase humanity. Captain Roberts noticed the change immediately. He wrote later in his journal, "As the last echoes of Kimigayo drifted into the humid morning air, something subtle yet profound began to unfold. The Japanese prisoners, once rigid and unyielding, shifted in their formations. Conversations that had been stifled for months started in whispers. A former sergeant quietly adjusted his uniform, straightening his posture as though the act itself restored a fragment of his lost honor. The psychological impact was immediate. Soldiers who had endured months of internalized shame and the constant pressure of expectations finally experienced a release. For some, tears that had been suppressed behind disciplined faces now flowed freely. Their culture demanded restraint, yet here, in the presence of those who had been their enemies, restraint seemed almost unnecessary. The anthem had created a space where vulnerability and dignity could coexist. American guards observed quietly, understanding the delicate balance. They had witnessed fear, anger, and resentment daily. Yet, in that moment, they saw respect reflected back at them. Captain Roberts noticed one prisoner approaching the edge of the formation. hesitant but compelled. He bowed slightly, almost imperceptibly, a gesture that bridged months of hostility. It was a silent acknowledgement. We see your humanity, and we honor it. The significance extended beyond the individuals. Within the camp, relationships began to shift. Prisoners were less resistant during daily routines. Cooperation increased in work details. A subtle, mutual recognition of shared humanity replaced the rigid hierarchy of captor and captive. Acts of small kindness, once rare and cautious, became more frequent. An American soldier passing rice might receive a nod of thanks. A Japanese prisoner fixing a fence might earn a glance of approval. Historians later emphasized that such moments were rare in the Pacific theater. The war had been brutal, fueled by ideological fervor and cultural misconceptions. Japanese soldiers had been trained to expect death rather than surrender, and Americans had faced extreme casualties in campaigns across the islands. In this context, the act of singing an enemy's anthem was revolutionary, not just emotionally, but morally. Eyewitness accounts reveal the lingering power of the moment. One former prisoner wrote in a post-war memoir, "I could not understand why they sang for us. Perhaps they saw what we had lost. Perhaps they wished to remind us we were not forgotten. That single song made me believe, for the first time in months, that not all Americans were our enemies." The act also served as a quiet lesson in leadership. Captain Roberts's decision to allow his soldiers to play Kimigayo demonstrated that authority does not always require dominance. Moral courage, he had shown, can be more transformative than physical strength. The soldiers who performed the anthem understood this instinctively. Their music became a vehicle for empathy, bridging the gap between cultures that had fought to annihilate each other. By the end of the day, the camp atmosphere had irrevocably changed. The prisoners walked with a subtle dignity, even as their captivity continued. The American guards, too, carried the weight of the moment, realizing that war is not only measured in victories on the battlefield, but also in gestures that restore humanity. In the weeks and months following that quiet morning, the Japanese prisoners began to experience a shift that went beyond the immediate emotional impact of the anthem. Repatriation became the central concern of camp authorities, and the U.S. Army moved deliberately to process thousands of men for transport back to a nation still reeling from surrender and nuclear devastation. The prisoners, once defined by shame and despair, carried themselves with a new, cautious dignity. They had seen an act of respect from the enemy, an acknowledgement of their identity that no decree or order could provide. Guards noted that compliance improved across the camp. Roll calls were met with precision, work details proceeded smoothly, and interactions with Americans were quieter, more measured, and even occasionally cooperative. The psychological toll of captivity began to ease. For many, the act of listening to their anthem performed by the Americans became a reference point, a reminder that honor could survive even defeat. One officer later reflected, "We had surrendered, yes, but in that moment, I felt alive in a way I had not since leaving Japan. They recognized our existence, our humanity. That changed everything." American officers recognized the broader implications. The U.S. Army's re-education programs, designed to instill democratic principles, respect for human life, and the understanding that surrender was not dishonorable, found fertile ground. Classes on civics, hygiene, and cultural exchange were met with curiosity rather than resistance. Prisoners engaged more readily, sometimes even discussing the war in reflective terms, recounting experiences with a newfound openness. At the same time, the U.S. military began documenting these gestures. Captain Roberts's reports emphasized the moral and strategic value of humane treatment. Not only did it reduce the risk of unrest, but it also planted the seeds for post-war cooperation. The act of playing Kimigayo was not an isolated symbolic gesture. It became a blueprint for handling POWs across the Pacific theater in the war's final stages. The camp itself transformed into a microcosm of reconciliation. Shared routines gained subtle warmth. Guards who had previously treated prisoners with strict formality now occasionally engaged in conversation, learning fragments of language, history, and culture. The prisoners responded, sometimes offering small lessons on etiquette or sharing food when available. It was not friendship in the traditional sense, but a recognition of common humanity. Fragile, but real. Historians note that such gestures contributed to the long-term perception of the United States and Japan after the war. Reports from returning POWs, letters, and later memoirs suggest that these experiences softened post-war attitudes, allowing for a narrative of reconciliation rather than resentment. Acts like the anthem performance provided a living example that victory did not require humiliation, and that moral authority could accompany military power. As the months progressed, the camp prepared for the repatriation of its prisoners. Ships arrived, first in small convoys, then in larger waves, carrying Japanese soldiers back to a homeland devastated by nuclear bombs, firebombing, and occupation. The men who had once stood in fearful silence now boarded these vessels with a quiet composure, carrying memories that were as complex as the war itself. Letters and memoirs from returning POWs reveal the depth of their transformation. Many wrote about the Anthem moment, describing it as both shocking and restorative. One officer recalled, "For a brief morning, we were not prisoners. We were men again. They honored us in a way that no surrender could erase." This experience influenced the way the men viewed Americans after the war. Instead of seeing them solely as conquerors, many acknowledged that individual acts of humanity could coexist with military dominance. When they returned home, some became vocal proponents of reconciliation, using their own experiences to encourage dialogue between former enemies. American veterans, too, carried these lessons forward. Those who had played or witnessed the anthem described it as one of the most powerful moments of their military service, a reminder that moral courage could rival bravery on the battlefield. In interviews conducted decades later, they reflected on how such gestures altered their perception of victory. It was no longer measured purely by territory or casualties, but by the ability to uphold humanity in the wake of destruction. History often measures war in numbers, battles won, cities destroyed, armies defeated. Yet, some of the most profound moments are measured not in statistics, but in emotion. The morning when American soldiers played Kimigayo for their Japanese prisoners stands as one of those rare instances. It was a simple act, yet its reverberations went far beyond the fences of a single POW camp. For the prisoners, the anthem restored something long thought lost: identity, honor, and a fragile sense of dignity. It reminded them that surrender, while painful, did not erase humanity. For the American soldiers, it was a lesson in moral courage, a reminder that true victory is measured not only by force, but by the capacity to act with empathy, even toward those who once fought to kill you. This event encapsulates the paradox of war. Destruction and humanity exist side by side. Across the Pacific, countless lives were lost, cities leveled, and cultures scarred. Yet in a quiet moment of music, enemies became witnesses to each other's humanity. The anthem did not erase the past, but it allowed a future built on recognition rather than resentment. Symbolically, the moment foreshadowed the principles that would guide post-war relations between Japan and the United States. Respect, empathy, and acknowledgement of identity became the foundation of reconstruction, reconciliation, and eventual alliance. It demonstrated that even small acts, a song, a gesture, a recognition, could ripple outward, influencing diplomacy, culture, and personal memory. Ultimately, this story is a reminder that war is not only fought with weapons and strategy. It is also fought in the quiet decisions that define who we are when the battle ends. In the fading notes of a national anthem, we see a truth often overlooked: that courage, honor, and humanity can survive even the most devastating conflicts, leaving an imprint that endures far beyond the battlefield. Fourth,